I found out what really happens to people who ask too many questions in my family. Growing up, I always thought my family was just really private. You know how some families share everything at dinner and others barely talk? We were the second type, but it wasn't until my cousin Danny went missing that I started to realize our family's version of private was something else entirely. Danny was the kind of guy who asked questions about everything. Why did Great Uncle Vincent really move to Florida? What happened to the money from Grandpa's life insurance? Why did we never visit Mom's side of the family anymore? At every family gathering, Danny would corner someone with his theories and observations, trying to piece together our family's history like some amateur detective. The adults always brushed him off with nervous laughs and quick subject changes. Danny's always been too curious for his own good, they'd say, ruffling his hair. But there was something in their eyes when they said it, something that looked almost like fear. When Danny turned 25, he started getting really serious about genealogy research. He'd show up to Sunday dinners with printouts from ancestry websites and old newspaper clippings he'd found at the library. He was obsessed with filling in the gaps in our family tree, especially the relatives who seemed to just disappear from records around the 1980s. My parents and aunts would get visibly uncomfortable whenever Danny pulled out his research folders. They'd start clearing dishes earlier than usual, or suddenly remember important phone calls they had to make. Uncle Ray would always change the subject to sports or work, but Danny never took the hint. He just kept digging. The last time I saw Danny was at my grandmother's 85th birthday party in March. He pulled me aside in the kitchen and showed me something that made my blood run cold. It was a death certificate for someone named Daniel Kovac, born the same year as Danny, who had died in a car accident 3 states away. "Look at this," Danny whispered, his hands shaking as he held the paper. "Same first name, same birth year, same month. And get this, the guy died 2 weeks after filing a missing person report for his own family member." He explained that he'd been tracking similar patterns for months. People with names similar to questioning family members, all dying in accidents or disappearing right after they started investigating family mysteries. Danny thought someone was creating fake death certificates to cover up something bigger. I told him he was getting paranoid, that it was just a weird coincidence. But Danny grabbed my arm and said he'd found evidence that our family wasn't who we thought we were, that our last name wasn't even real, and everyone had been living under false identities since before we were born. He said he was going to confront Dad about it the next day. That was on a Sunday. By Wednesday, Danny was gone. His apartment was cleaned out, his car was missing, and his job said he'd called in his resignation. Just like that, my cousin who asked too many questions had vanished. The family's reaction was what really unsettled me. Instead of panic or concern, there was this collective sigh of relief. Danny was always talking about moving somewhere new, Aunt Linda said at the dinner table. Good for him for finally doing it. But I'd known Danny my whole life, and he'd never mentioned wanting to move anywhere. He was saving up for a down payment on a house 3 blocks from his mom. Something was wrong, but when I tried to bring it up, the conversation would die instantly. I started paying closer attention to family conversations after that. How certain topics would create uncomfortable silences. How questions about our history would get deflected with jokes or distractions. How some relatives I remembered from childhood were never mentioned anymore, like they'd been erased from our family's memory. My dad noticed me getting curious about the same things Danny had been interested in. He pulled me aside after dinner one night and said something that still gives me chills. "Son, some families have secrets that are better left buried. Danny forgot that, and now he's paying the price for being too smart for his own good." When I asked what he meant by paying the price, Dad's face went completely blank. He said Danny was fine, just living his new life somewhere else, but he wouldn't look me in the eyes when he said it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the relatives who'd supposedly moved away over the years. Cousin Michael, who asked too many questions about Grandpa's military service. Aunt Ruth, who wouldn't stop digging into Mom's first marriage. Uncle Frank, who kept pushing for details about the family business. All of them had supposedly relocated for jobs or relationships, but none of them had kept in touch. The next morning, I did something that probably saved my life. Instead of confronting anyone directly, I started my own quiet investigation. I went to the library and looked up every family member who'd allegedly moved away in the past 20 years. What I found made my hands shake so bad I could barely turn the pages. There were no forwarding addresses, no new jobs, no paper trails of any kind. It was like these people had simply been erased from existence. But the most disturbing part was finding death certificates for people with similar names in other states, all dated within weeks of their supposed relocations. I realized Danny had been right about the fake death certificates. Someone with access to official records was creating false identities and death records to explain why questioning family members disappeared. The pattern was too precise to be coincidental. I spent the next 3 weeks documenting everything I could find without asking anyone in the family for help. I made copies of documents, took photos of newspaper clippings, and started building the same kind of evidence file that Danny had been working on. The more I discovered, the more terrified I became of what my family was really capable of. That's when I found the insurance policies. Every family member who disappeared had life insurance policies that paid out to surviving relatives shortly after their supposed deaths. The beneficiaries were always my parents, Aunt Linda, and Uncle Ray. The same 3 people who seemed to be in charge of family decisions and who always steered conversations away from uncomfortable topics. I realized I wasn't dealing with a family secret. I was dealing with a family business. A business that involved making people disappear and profiting from their deaths. The night I found the insurance documents, I heard voices coming from the basement. I crept downstairs and listened through the door as my parents, Aunt Linda and Uncle Ray, discussed what to do about me. They knew I'd been asking questions and researching family history. They'd been watching me, following me to the library, monitoring my online activity. Uncle Ray said I was becoming as big a problem as Danny had been, and that they needed to handle the situation before I figured out too much. My blood turned to ice when I heard Aunt Linda say they'd already prepared the paperwork for my relocation. She had a death certificate printed with my name on it, listing a drowning accident in Oregon dated for the following week. My mom's voice was shaking when she said she didn't want to do this to another family member, but Uncle Ray reminded her how much money they'd made from the other disappearances. He said one more payout would set them up for life, and that I was too smart to let live anyway. I barely made it back to my room without making noise. My own family was planning to murder me and stage my death to collect insurance money. The same thing they'd done to Danny and who knows how many others over the years. I realized I had maybe days before they put their plan into action. I couldn't go to the police because I didn't know how many people were involved in this conspiracy. If my family could create fake death certificates and disappear people without leaving traces, they probably had connections in law enforcement too. That night, I packed a bag with cash and the evidence I'd collected. I left a note saying I was going camping for the weekend and drove 6 hours to a motel in a different state. I needed time to figure out how to expose what was happening without getting myself killed in the process. From the motel room, I started calling the police departments in the towns where the fake death certificates had been filed. I told them I had evidence of insurance fraud and identity theft, but I didn't mention my family's involvement yet. 3 of the departments were interested enough to set up meetings. The detective in Oregon was particularly helpful because they'd been investigating suspicious drowning deaths for months. When I showed him the death certificate with my name on it, dated for the future, his face went white. He said this was the first hard evidence they'd found of the document forgery operation they'd been tracking. Within 2 hours, he had me connected with federal investigators who specialized in insurance fraud and organized crime families. The FBI agent assigned to my case was a woman named Detective Sarah Walsh, who'd been investigating my family for 2 years. She said they'd suspected something was wrong when multiple life insurance claims from the same beneficiaries kept getting filed in different states, but they couldn't prove the deaths were fake without someone on the inside willing to testify. She explained that my family was part of a larger network that had been operating for decades, using fake identities and staged deaths to defraud insurance companies out of millions of dollars. Detective Walsh showed me files on 23 family members who'd supposedly died or disappeared over the past 30 years. All of them had been asking questions about family business or getting too curious about relatives who'd vanished before them. She said the operation was sophisticated enough that they'd avoided detection by spreading the fake deaths across multiple states and using different insurance companies. My evidence was exactly what they needed to build a RICO case against the entire network. But Detective Walsh warned me that coming forward meant I could never go home again. My family would know I'd betrayed them, and they had connections dangerous enough to reach me anywhere in the country. She offered to put me in witness protection, but that meant giving up my identity and never seeing anyone from my old life again. The alternative was testifying at trial and hoping we could put enough of them in prison to keep me safe. Neither option felt like living, but staying silent meant more family members would die. I chose to testify. The FBI set me up in a safe house while they built their case, and I spent 3 months going through every detail of what I'd discovered. They brought in other family members I'd assumed were dead, people who'd managed to escape before the family could kill them. Turns out Cousin Michael was alive and hiding in Canada. Aunt Ruth had faked her own death to get away from them and had been living under an assumed name in Texas for 8 years. Each survivor had a similar story of discovering the family's true business and barely escaping with their lives. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and I had to testify for 2 full days about everything I'd found. Sitting in that courtroom, looking at my parents and relatives in handcuffs, was the most surreal experience of my life. These people had raised me, taught me how to ride a bike, celebrated my birthdays, all while running a murder-for-profit operation that had killed dozens of people over 3 decades. My mom wouldn't look at me during the trial, but Uncle Ray stared me down like he was memorizing my face for later. The jury found them guilty on all counts. My parents got life sentences without parole. Uncle Ray and Aunt Linda got 25 to life. 4 other relatives I'd barely known were arrested as part of the network and received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. The judge said it was one of the most extensive family-based organized crime operations he'd ever seen. Detective Walsh told me they recovered over $3 million in fraudulent insurance payouts, but estimated the total operation had generated more than $10 million over 30 years. After the sentencing, I had to make the hardest decision of my life. Even with most of the family in prison, Detective Walsh said there were still network members who hadn't been caught, people who might want revenge for destroying the operation. She strongly recommended witness protection, but I was exhausted from running and hiding. I wanted to try to build a normal life somewhere, even if it meant looking over my shoulder forever. I moved across the country and changed my name legally through the courts, got a job using my college degree, and tried to blend into a community where nobody knew my history. For the first year, every phone call made my heart race. Every stranger who looked at me twice made me wonder if they'd been sent by surviving family members. But gradually, the fear faded into background caution. I learned to live with the constant awareness that my past could catch up with me, but not to let it control every decision. 2 years after the trial, I got a letter forwarded through Detective Walsh. It was from Danny, who was alive and living in witness protection in the Pacific Northwest. He said he'd figured out what was happening just in time to fake his own death and escape. He'd been working with the FBI for months before I came forward, gathering evidence from the outside. Reading his letter made me cry for the first time since this whole nightmare started. At least one person I'd thought was dead had actually survived. Danny's letter explained that our family had started as legitimate people who'd gotten involved with insurance scammers in the 1970s. Over time, the easy money from fake death claims became too tempting to resist. They started targeting their own family members who asked inconvenient questions, turning family curiosity into a death sentence. He estimated that at least 40 people had been murdered over 5 decades, all for insurance payouts that funded the family's comfortable lifestyle. The hardest part of rebuilding my life wasn't the fear or the isolation. It was the guilt of enjoying things my murdered relatives never got to experience. Every birthday, every promotion at work, every normal moment felt like it should have belonged to Danny or Michael or Ruth or one of the other victims. Detective Walsh helped me find a therapist who specialized in survivor trauma, and she taught me that living fully was the best way to honor the people who didn't make it out. 3 years later, I met someone who made me want to trust again. Telling her my story was terrifying, but she listened without judgment and said my past made her admire my courage, not fear my family's violence. We've been married for 2 years now, and I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night worried that someone from the old network has found us. But more often, I wake up grateful that asking the right questions at the right time saved my life instead of ending it. I keep in touch with Danny through encrypted emails routed through Detective Walsh's office. He says he's doing well in his new life, working as a librarian in a small town where nobody asks about his past. We both agree that curiosity almost got us killed, but ultimately it also set us free. The difference was learning when to ask questions quietly and when to run with the answers we found. Last month, Detective Walsh called to tell me they'd arrested the last known member of the network, a distant relative who'd been laundering money through legitimate businesses for decades. She said I was officially safe from family retaliation, but I don't think I'll ever feel completely secure. When your own parents plan your murder for insurance money, it changes how you see the world forever. The strangest part of surviving all this is realizing how many families have secrets they're willing to kill to protect. Not necessarily murder-for-profit schemes, but dark truths that certain relatives will do anything to keep buried. I've learned to recognize the signs in other people's families, the conversations that stop when certain names are mentioned, the relatives who supposedly moved away but never visit, the uncomfortable silences when someone asks innocent questions about family history. If you're still here, you're a true fan of these stories. Show some support with a like and subscribe to catch the next one.